Tea is one of the most popular drinks in the world, only competing with water and coffee in terms of people drinking it. When thinking of tea, what comes to mind? Maybe you think of chai. What about matcha lattes from Starbucks? Perhaps you even think of the fancy little drinks you get from your local cafe advertising a lavender tea or rosebud tea. To correct these lackluster definitions surrounding tea, it may surprise you that only a few of these could even be considered as tea. Tea can only be derived from the Camellia sinensis plant, specifically the leaves. If it isn't tea. It could be a brew or a drink, but it won't be tea. Take this chrysanthemum quote unquote tea, for example. The drink is brewed from these chrysanthemum flowers, and although it looks like what red tea would look like when it's brewed, it isn't tea. This jasmine tea, however, is derived from the plant and has gone through the cultivation and preparations a green tea would, and is considered tea. It smells good too. To understand connoisseurship, we need to begin at the start. The legend goes that in 2730 BC, Shannon, the father of agriculture and a mythic emperor, had sat under a Camellia sinensis bush and a few leaves had dropped it into the boiling pot of water next to him, creating the very first pot of tea. Now, looking at the actual historical accounts, it was probably during the 7th to 13th century where inventiveness had eventually led to the cultivation of a tea culture. There were more techniques for agriculture being created, and a highly developed domestic and foreign trade system existed. People finally had the leisure time to enjoy things rather than eat solely for the purpose of consumption, allowing for the development of tea attitudes and connoisseurship later on. Now you can see evidence of such in Louis Chajing, the classic of tea, one of the earliest and most famous works regarding tea drinking culture. The contents indicated that tea had been drunk for a much longer period than before when he wrote the piece, the book mostly reflecting on the poetic nature and enjoying tea itself during the Tang Dynasty rather than how to serve tea. Now, tea attitudes and especially connoisseurship consist of the entire timeline of enjoying tea. The preparation and the etiquette are only about half the story, so it's important to look at the value of the cultivation of these tea leaves as well. It seems that any good tea connoisseur sources their tea directly from tea farmers. Might it be Professor Tea from a reading or West China Tea House? They all have their sources, most often being smaller scale or family owned tea farms. Now that's because most smaller scale tea farmers produce premium tea, which are usually whole leaves, smaller in quantity, and much more expensive, going about $10 to $20 per ounce. Now, this cost is excused by the quality of the product, though. The leaves are usually picked during the winter and spring, as it's the prime time for harvest, since the tea leaves are at their sweetest and least bitter. Farmers usually look out for the most tender 2 to 3 leaves at the top of the branch or flower buds, as they're the youngest parts of the plant and thus are sweeter and more flavorful than the rest of the leaves. This process isn't universal though, as some types of tea are made from older leaves, such as oolong. Now, these leaves are then picked and then carefully processed to be oxidized and fermented, dried, and cooked, all by hand. Now, this is also why connoisseurs really usually have multiple farms they work with, as specializing in certain types of tea allows for a better focus on quality. Along with these advantages, appreciation for premium teas is also correlated with Chinese traits of rarity. The most regarded teas are those that take the most time and the most labor intensive to cultivate, both time and labor being traits of rarity to look out for. Like what Louis wrote in Chajing, the essence of tea connoisseurship and attitudes comes from savoring the tea, the flavors in the tea, and finding a poetic nature in drinking tea in general. In order to do that, though, you have to know how to brew tea first, and for that, time and temperature must be considered along with your teaware and how you're brewing the tea. In the first place. So each type of tea has its own sweet spot. Whether or not the resulting beverage you get becoming overly bitter is entirely up to how educated you are in that. Here's a chart, thankfully, on what temperatures each type of tea works best in. Thank you so much, West China Tea House, for that. But after that, the question of teaware comes up. When you first delve into tea attitudes, it's normal to have a very basic setup, but similarly to tea leaves, connoisseurship appears in the quality and personal choice of your teaware. Teawares go much more in depth style by style, and it differs based on region, but a basic setup usually starts out with a teapot, which I do not have, and a cup. Some things we're looking for in a teapot is to not lose too much temperature when brewing, to avoid flavor loss. As we mentioned before, the temperature you initially brew your tea at is also pertinent for the flavor profile. So let's take a look at some of the most sought after and expensive teapots, which all have the ideal qualifications of a teapot. Looking at the Zusha teapots, they're some of the oldest teapots ever made, and some even being historical artifacts, creating a significant cultural value to them. They're also made from this rare, non-replenishable ore called Zusha, which is mixed into clay and results in properties that slow down temperature loss very efficiently, mind you, and intensifies the flavor of tea. even to even make these teapots in the first place requires a really lengthy trial of training, and becoming a senior master requires at least 25 years of experience. The traits of rarity, such as the cultural significance, the uniqueness of the teapot, the difficulty to acquire, and the time and labor costs it even like requires to make this teapot, included with the artistry of making a teapot in general, it all results in a single pot costing up to $90,000 sometimes. But thankfully for your wallet, getting a shot teapot isn't the end goal for all tea enjoyers. Though these are amazing qualities for a teapot, in the end it's really up to personal preference. A connoisseur may choose another type of pot, one that's more to their own artistic taste, or one that flavors the tea in a way they like. It doesn't make them less of a connoisseur, as in the end, they're appreciating the tea. It allows for personalization in a culture that otherwise values the group more than the individual, which is another level of tea attitudes that should be highlighted. This personalization goes further into teapots as well, which are usually cup-sized clay figurines that sit next to you when you pour tea. While ornamental, they're also a way to provide company if you're drinking alone, be a part of the tea etiquette, or even temperature indicators. As time goes on, ideally your tea pet becomes darker and more oily, kind of like you're nourishing your pet as you drink it. And it's believed with enough care, your tea pet pays you back in wealth, luck, and longevity. But again, it's important to note that it's all up to personal preference. Sometimes you even have a resin color changing teapot for no other reason than aesthetic. Sometimes you'll have a metal teapot, wooden ones, some made out of bamboo, some that looks like animals, or sometimes we have even a little peeing child, which I'll pull up here. But um, you could also be like me and have a rock that you really like. This is a bismuth at the teapot. And it really highlights that there aren't any strict rules around your choice in teaware. And that applies to your choice in teapots as well as the art teaware. There's a lot of customization, and in the end, it's choosing what's best for those enjoying the tea. That's the most important. Now we're finally looking at tea etiquette, and for the purpose of our research, we'll be looking into Gongfu Cha, a tea style that originated in Chaozhou, and it means preparing your tea with skill. As some tea masters might say, it's like a form of martial arts. You have to know and practice the process to a tea. You'll be seeing the real-life examples of what we were only looking at a bit earlier. Here are the necessary teaware for the style. You can see the teapots, the teapets, and the teacups, as well as more advanced teaware such as the tea tray and the Gongdao Bei. These are requirements for Gongfu Cha, but may not be for other styles. Now, looking at our process over here, you can see that in the background, our server is warming up the teacups while we are feeding the tea pet. Now, in this clip, we're being served the third steep of the tea. Notice how he's pouring it into the Gongdao Bei and how it's being served to us first. It's not in the clip, but he did serve himself afterwards. In these clips, we're smelling and tasting the tea. And finally, at the end of our session, you can see that the tea pet is very well fed.